The month of September has always been special for us. You may remember it was so last year too. So now, in our series of Poets and Poetry by Indira, we are going to take you into the world of Dalit poetry. Is it different? Is it special? Well, you must tune in every Friday to listen to our special episode on Dalit poetry. Remember, every Friday all through September. The poet that I have today is Nandanar. He was one of the Nayanmars. I have to take you to that period of Tamil literature and history. So you realize that he was a Tamil poet. Remember, when we think of Dalit poetry, we think of it as being as recent as the 20th century. We think of the Great Awakening, post-independence or just about pre-independence. And so when I'm talking about Nandanar, I'm going to take you back to the 8th, 9th, 10th centuries. Well, who was Nandanar? In Tamil Nadu, there was a group of religious poets. They are called Shaivite religious poets because they sang in praise of Lord Shiva. Because I must tell you, just for your knowledge, that it was at the same time you also have the 12 Alvars who were Vaishnavite poets or sang in praise of Vishnu. So to come back to our poet of the day, Nandanar. So he was, I want to repeat, one of the Nayanmars who flourished between the 8th and the 12th century and wrote in Tamil in praise of Lord Shiva. The poet is Nandanar, known by many names, and one interesting name, which I'm going to talk about later, is Tirunalai Povar. Tillai Tirunalai Povar. I'll come to that. But he could have lived anywhere between the 8th and the 12th century. We don't know his exact dates. We do know, however, that he belonged to the Puliyar caste. And what does that caste do? They are, of course, an untouchable caste. Probably he was a bonded labor. He played an instrument called the yara and sang devotional songs. But with the rules of those days, he could not enter the temple. He could not enter the temple, so he stood outside and sang in praise of the Lord. A list was made by the great Sundarar, and he listed all the 63 Nayanmars. And that is where we first see that Nandanar also was a Nayanmar. Remember the 63 saint poets I talked about? I love stories which are associated with our temples, and this is about one such who we call Dalit today. So it was said that Nandanar could not enter the temple. He was a great devout bhakta of Shiva. So he stood outside the temple and he sang songs. One day he took courage in his hands and moved a little closer to the temple. Those of us who have been to Shiva temples know that there is a Nandi, which is his vahana, which is his vehicle, the bull. So the bull was there in front and then Shiva is behind in the sanctum sanctorum. And Nandanar could not see Shiva. So he sang another song in praise of Shiva and saying, I came to see you, but I couldn't see you because the Nandi blocked my view. The story goes, the temple is in Tirupangur. And I must tell you what I'm going to narrate, how it must have been true, I don't know. So Shiva tells the Nandi, move away because I can't see my bhakta. I love that song. He does not say, my bhakta cannot see me. He says, I cannot see my bhakta, so move away. In that temple, and I had tears in my eyes thinking of this song, where the bull even today, Nandi even today, is not in front of Shiva, but is a little to the side. And the Purohit there did tell me the story. And then when I was researching for this poem, I said, wow, it seems to be true. Such was the bhakti of Nandanar. Then the story goes that he wanted to go to Tillai. Tillai is the local name for the great town of Chidambaram. Again, I have to go back to Tamil Nadu and talk to you about the Shiva temples. Remember, this is not about temples, but it is about the great poet, right? So he wanted to go to Tillai, and he knew once again he would not be allowed entry. So every day he's supposed to have consoled himself saying, no problem, I'll go tomorrow. And it is Nalai Povar, I will go tomorrow, right? So jokingly, people started calling him Tillai Nalai Povar. His name became, right, the one who will go tomorrow to Tillai. The story goes on that he did go and he had to walk through fire. Somebody says he was burnt alive. Somebody says it was God's grace. But I don't want to go into all that. All that I want to tell you that this great devout bhakta, devotee of Lord Shiva, has become so famous in folklore that you have operas and films made on him. You have folk music with his songs. It is that devout Shiva Bhakta poet, one of the Nayanmars, Nandanar, whose poem I am going to talk about in this episode. The poem by Nandanar is titled Shiv Shivayam. Let me read a couple of lines in Tamil first, and maybe I'll read again, but to begin with. En appan allava, en taayum allava. En appan allava, en taayum allava. So very simply it says, you are my father, you are also my mother. But you know, with the right intonation, you have to see that it's a kind of an exclamation. It's not a question. It's not a statement. Aren't you my father? Aren't you my mother? You are everything to me. Kannara muda kadale potri. Shirar perundurai nam tevanadi potri. What is he saying? Glory to the Lord of the ocean's nectar. I can't go into all those stories, but I'm sure you remember Shiva is also called Nilakanta, the one with the blue throat. Why? Because he is supposed to have swallowed the poison, and that's another story of the Manthan. So he says, Kannara muda kadale potri, Shirar perundurai nam tevanadi potri. Glory be to the Lord, praise be to his feet. I want to draw your attention that this was a kind of poetry that was common in the Bhakti movement. The Bhakti movement in India came much later, you will tell me, true. But the sentiments, the love for God, the way you express your love for God, as we see here, is the same that we are going to see much later in Kabir or Meera. Arada inbam arulum malai potri. Arada. Without end, infinite, the divinity, the divine. Glory be to the Lord who bestows the joy of divinity. Let me read that again in Tamil. Because something about the original language in which a poet writes adds a certain musicality, which no translation can hope to achieve, to attain. Arada inbam arulum malai potri. Kayilai malayane potri, 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 potri. Kayilai malayane. Malay is hill, mountain. Kayilai is Kailasha. What do you mean, ma'am? I can hear you ask. If you were my students, I'm sure you will ask, how can Kailasha be Kayilai? I can't but help go to the language, because there is no sa, there is no sha in Tamil. And therefore, Kailash is Kailai. People who know to read and write Tamil might say, of course we have it, ma'am. But that's only about 500 years old that such letters were introduced. That would be an entire lecture of linguistics, not for today. Kailai Malaine Potri, Potri, Porotri. Glory be to, glory be to, glory be to, he says. Shiva Shivayam, Shiva Shivayam, Shiva Shivayam. That has become the title of this poem. Remember, many poems down the ages in all languages and all times across the world do not have titles. So what do? We probably take the first line of the poem and make it the title. I have dealt with such poems in my earlier lectures. Sometimes what do we do? The publisher probably, the editor probably takes the main theme. So what is this poem about? So he says, Shiva Shivayam, Shiva Shivayam, Shiva Shivayam. Glory be to Lord Shiva, glory be to Lord Shiva. And then he repeats, like a refrain. I've been telling you repetition is very important in poetry because it draws our attention, the attention of the reader. So those lines with which the poem began, En appanallava, en tayumallava, en appanallava, en tayumallava. Unto you, my father, unto you, my father. Remember, for an untouchable of those days, for an outcast, for somebody who didn't have permission to enter the temple, to look at the great Lord and say, you are my father, you are my mother. And he's not saying you are, but he says, aren't you? En appanallava, aren't you my father, aren't you my mother? And then he goes on, Ponnappanallava. Aren't you made of gold? We have to remember that he's never been into the temple, that he's never seen the form of the God, and therefore he does not know. And I want you to remember, this is not a temple where he's a Shivalinga, where he's in the Linga form. Here he is in the human form of Shiva. So then he says, Soppanamo endan appan Thiruviral. Is this only a dream? Sopnama? Is it only a sapna? Karpittoma enna arpudam iduve. Just a figment of my imagination? No. I saw Adiya Padane. I saw the legs which were dancing. Remember, one of the forms of Lord Shiva is Nataraja, the dancing god. And then comes the moment of sorrow, the moment of sadness. After all, I am a poor untouchable standing outside the temple. And then he says, Nin arnda karunane erai ariveno. Can this poor man ever understand your great compassion, your great mercy? He goes on putting it a little differently. Erai ariveno, erai ariveno, erai ariveno. Will this poor man ever understand? Shiva Shivayam, Shiva Shivayam, Shiva Shivayam. Glory to the great Shiva. Great poetry can be written on any subject. When I look at a poem like this, I wonder if among the subjects of the world, devotion is one important subject. Yes, certainly all languages across the world, the earliest poems, remember, were sung. We didn't call them poems, maybe we call them songs, maybe we call them bhajans, maybe we call them hymns, but they're all in the poetic form and they're all sung in praise of God. Maybe this poem will help us move on to many such poems.